In the quiet town of Riverside, everyone knew the name Officer Derek Slater. Not because he was a hero, and not because he protected the people, but because he was the one you didn't want to cross. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always wearing mirrored sunglasses, Slater moved through the city with an air of untouchability. His badge wasn't just identification, it was a weapon. Over the course of 15 years, Slater had built a reputation as the man who could get away with anything. Traffic stops that ended in humiliation. Routine checks that mysteriously targeted people of color. Arrests without evidence. Slater operated on instinct, but that instinct always seemed to lean one way. He knew how to cover his tracks. He knew which reports to write and which ones to leave vague. He had friends in all the right places and a history of complaints that never made it past the first page. His name never appeared in public headlines because he made sure it didn't. In a town built on silence and hierarchy, Slater was king. So when he saw the black SUV rolling down Sycamore Avenue that evening, he didn't hesitate. No speeding, no broken taillights, just a gut feeling that this driver didn't belong. He hit the lights, pulled the car over, and stepped out like he had 100 times before. Confident, casual, and completely unaware that this time, everything was about to change. Behind the wheel wasn't some scared teenager or someone who would fumble for their wallet in fear. It was Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter, a decorated officer in the U.S. Army with 20 years of service, nerves of steel, and a pocket-sized body camera recording every move. Slater thought he was making another routine stop, but in truth, he had just ignited a storm. If you believe justice can come from the most unexpected moments, press 7 in the comments to follow the rest of this unbelievable story. Because the man who feared nothing was about to meet the woman who feared no one. The lights flashed red and blue behind her, cutting through the early evening haze as Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter pulled her black SUV smoothly to the curb. Her heart didn't race, her hands didn't shake. This wasn't her first traffic stop, but something told her it was going to be different. She looked into the side mirror and saw him, Officer Derek Slater, stepping out of his cruiser with the kind of swagger that didn't belong to someone enforcing law, but someone enforcing power. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, not because he needed it, but because he wanted her to see it. "License and registration," he barked before even reaching the window. Naomi rolled it down slowly. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "You fit the description." "Of what?" he didn't say. She calmly handed over her license, military ID on top. Slater glanced at it for less than a second before tossing it back onto her lap. "Step out of the vehicle." No explanation, no legal cause, just command. Naomi could have resisted, could have invoked the law, her rank, her right, but instead she obeyed, because she knew something Slater didn't. Clipped discreetly to her lapel was a hidden recording device, already capturing every word. And in the side door panel, a second phone was live streaming to a secure server, silently documenting everything from a wide-angle lens. As she stepped out, Slater immediately moved behind her, twisting her arms into handcuffs. He wasn't subtle, he wasn't careful, but Naomi didn't flinch. "You've got an attitude," he muttered. "We don't like that around here." She didn't respond, but she was thinking, "You just made the worst mistake of your career." As pedestrians passed by, some looked away, others paused, but no one stepped in. They'd seen Slater before. They knew how this went. Only this time, it wasn't going the way he expected, because Naomi wasn't some helpless civilian. She was a high-ranking U.S. Army officer, trained in law, leadership, and resilience. And she wasn't going to yell. She was going to expose him, piece by piece, frame by frame, word by word. And it all started here, with a simple traffic stop that changed everything. Inside the Riverside Police Department, the air was stale and the tension thick. Officer Derek Slater walked in with his usual swagger, escorting Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter through the front doors in handcuffs, as if she were some petty criminal instead of a decorated U.S. Army officer. Her posture remained upright, unfazed, her expression unreadable. Even in custody, she radiated command. That alone was enough to rattle the routine. Slater dropped her license and military ID onto the desk at booking and muttered, "Refuse to comply. Possible obstruction." She was acting suspicious. The desk officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing. No one questioned Slater out loud. He had a reputation, feared by some, admired by others, tolerated by most. The kind of cop who pushed boundaries because he could, because no one had ever held him accountable. But Sergeant Miguel Alvarez wasn't most people. He sat behind the glass partition and caught sight of the ID as it slid across the desk. Something about the name stopped him cold. He stood up, stepped closer, and picked up the card. Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter, U.S. Army, Bronze Star, Joint Task Command. His instincts kicked in like muscle memory. Alvarez had done 2 tours in Iraq. He knew what kind of authority and responsibility came with a title like that, and he knew instantly that this wasn't some routine traffic stop gone wrong. This was something else. He turned to Slater. "You sure about this one?" Slater shrugged. "Smart mouth. Didn't follow orders. Thought her uniform gave her immunity." Alvarez didn't argue. He just walked back to his desk and pulled up Naomi's military records through secure channels. What he saw confirmed his concern. High clearance, active duty, clean record. More importantly, a direct point of contact at the Judge Advocate General's office. That wasn't standard for most soldiers. That was someone plugged into high places. Without hesitation, Alvarez picked up the phone and called the number listed on her emergency military contact form. On the other end, a firm voice answered, "Colonel Victor Delgado speaking." 10 minutes later, Delgado was in his car. 30 minutes after that, he walked through the station's front entrance with 2 military legal advisors in full uniform. The atmosphere shifted like a storm front rolling in. Delgado didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He calmly handed a sealed envelope to the captain on duty. Formal notice of misconduct, filed under Article 138 UCMJ, effective immediately. Within moments, Naomi was uncuffed and offered an apology she neither accepted nor acknowledged. Slater stood dumbfounded, unsure how quickly control had slipped from his grip. He started to stammer something about miscommunication and standard procedure, but Delgado silenced him with a glance. "This isn't over, Officer Slater," he said coldly. "You don't get to abuse power and walk away clean. Not anymore." The entire department seemed to exhale at once. For years, Slater had operated unchecked. But now he wasn't the hunter. He was the headline waiting to happen. And behind every desk, every phone, every quiet stare in that station, someone had finally taken notice. Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter stood silently as the cuffs were finally removed from her wrists. The red marks left behind were temporary, but what had been set in motion was not. She didn't speak. She didn't smirk. She simply looked Officer Derek Slater in the eyes, not with rage, but with the kind of calm certainty that unsettles even the most confident bully. That kind of look doesn't scream vengeance. It promises truth. Behind her, Colonel Victor Delgado exchanged clipped words with the precinct captain, who now appeared more like a man trying to avoid becoming collateral damage. Delgado had already filed a formal military complaint, activated a Department of Defense liaison, and alerted internal affairs in the state police. This was no longer a local matter, it was a federal issue, and it was moving fast. Slater tried to laugh it off as Naomi walked past him. "You know how these things go," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "We write a few reports, shake a few hands, and everyone forgets." Naomi stopped in her tracks. She didn't turn around. She didn't blink. She just said, "I don't forget." Then she walked out. Within hours, the footage from her hidden body cam was uploaded to a secure legal portal. Delgado's team reviewed it line by line. The tone in Slater's voice, the unnecessary escalation, the moment he ignored her identification, that was enough. But Naomi didn't stop there. She submitted a comprehensive misconduct file, detailing not only her own arrest, but referencing more than 40 other complaints against Slater she'd uncovered through independent watchdog reports and community advocacy databases. She copied in Audrey Nguyen, a veteran internal affairs investigator who had long been waiting for a catalyst strong enough to challenge the blue wall of silence. That catalyst had arrived. Audrey called Naomi that evening. "We're opening a full investigation," she said. But I need everything you have. Naomi replied without hesitation, "You'll have it before sunrise." And she meant it. Because Naomi Carter wasn't simply looking for justice for herself. She was setting fire to a pattern, to a system that had let men like Slater operate unchecked for far too long. This wasn't just about one bad stop. It was about the storm she was about to unleash. And the badge would no longer protect those who wore it without honor. For years, the people of Riverside whispered. Stories of Officer Derek Slater's misconduct circulated quietly. At barber shops, church basements, family cookouts. A wrongful stop here, a bruised arm there, teens frisked without cause, veterans questioned with no respect. But the system never listened. Complaints were lost in paperwork, voices buried under fear. Slater was untouchable and everyone knew it. Speaking up meant risking your job, your peace, sometimes your safety. Until Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter spoke for them all. The release of her arrest video was a spark in dry timber. It swept across Riverside like wildfire. Local advocacy groups shared the footage. Civil rights attorneys dissected it in town hall meetings. Audrey Nguyen, the internal affairs investigator Naomi had looped in, began fielding phone calls. Dozens, then hundreds, from residents who had once stayed silent, now ready to speak. At first it was anonymous tips, quiet men with lowered voices, mothers recalling traffic stops where their sons were treated like criminals, business owners recounting how Slater inspected their properties without warrants. A high school teacher confessed to seeing him shove a student against a patrol car, but was too scared to file a report. Then came the veterans. One by one, they stepped forward. Men and women who had worn the uniform, just like Naomi. Some had served in Korea, others in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam. They gathered in the basement of a local VFW post, not to mourn, but to organize. Naomi joined them in civilian clothes, notebook in hand. She didn't speak at first. She listened. "I always thought I was the only one," said a retired Army sergeant named Davis, voice cracking. "I thought maybe I did something wrong." "You didn't," Naomi said softly. "They did." That night, they formed the Riverside Accountability Coalition, a group made up of veterans, clergy, teachers, and everyday citizens committed to exposing misconduct and advocating reform. Within a week, they'd secured pro bono legal counsel and organized a public storytelling event at the local community center. The room overflowed. Old men with canes, young activists with notepads, mothers with tears in their eyes. And standing in the back, arms folded, was Naomi. No longer alone, no longer just a whistleblower. She had become a catalyst. As person after person took the mic to share their stories, it became clear. This wasn't just about Slater. It was about all the times no one listened. And now, people were finally ready to be heard. The darkness that once protected power was now being lit by truth. And the community of Riverside, long divided by fear, was starting to rise as one. The pressure on the Riverside Police Department had been building for days, but behind closed doors, it wasn't accountability they were planning, it was damage control. Public outrage had grown beyond the borders of the small town. Civil rights organizations were calling for an independent investigation. Local news outlets had been running segments on Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter's wrongful arrest for 4 nights straight. The dash cam footage, her military credentials, and her calm composure in the face of blatant abuse made it impossible for anyone to look away. But instead of addressing the misconduct, the department's internal leadership had a different strategy. They decided to go after Naomi. An emergency meeting was held in the chief's office. The language was coded, but the message was clear. She escalated. She should have complied faster. Her military background doesn't exempt her from protocol. A memo circulated quietly, recommending Naomi be placed under investigation for interfering with a lawful stop and disrespecting a peace officer. It was the kind of bureaucratic maneuver meant to scare people into silence. But Naomi wasn't alone anymore. Before the ink dried on that memo, Colonel Victor Delgado held a press conference outside City Hall. With Naomi by his side and cameras from 3 different news outlets rolling, he read aloud from the department's own policy book, line by line, proving that every action Naomi took was within her rights. He exposed the retaliatory tactics as not only unethical, but unconstitutional. Then in a moment that changed everything, Audrey Nguyen stepped forward and announced that she had opened a parallel investigation into the leadership of the Riverside Police Department. Not just Officer Slater, but the supervisors who had enabled him, the colleagues who looked away, and the system that tried to silence the truth. The public response was immediate and fierce. Students walked out of school in protest. Local veterans released a joint statement defending Naomi. Church leaders called for a community-led oversight board, and city council members, feeling the pressure, scheduled a formal hearing. Meanwhile, inside the department, unease grew. Officers who once stood behind Slater now quietly distanced themselves. Files once buried were being reopened. The old rulebook no longer applied, and the people were watching. The department had tried to silence a soldier. Instead, they amplified her voice. And Naomi? She didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply said, "This is bigger than me now. It always was." If you believe in truth over cover-ups, comment 7 below to keep following this story. If this kind of justice doesn't sit right with you, drop a 0 and tell us why. Either way, the conversation has started. And this time, it won't be silenced. The city council chamber was standing room only. Veterans in uniform filled the front rows. Teachers, students, local pastors, small business owners, and activists packed the aisles. News crews lined the walls, cameras ready. The hum of anticipation was thick in the air. This wasn't just another public hearing. This was a reckoning. At the center of it all sat Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter, flanked by Colonel Victor Delgado and Audrey Nguyen, the internal affairs investigator who had become a local hero in her own right. Naomi wore a crisp black blazer over a plain white blouse. No uniform, no medals. She didn't need them. Her poise spoke louder than brass. The council chair gavelled the room to order. "Colonel Carter," he said, nodding, "you may begin." Naomi rose. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't deliver a dramatic speech. She simply told the truth. Calmly, deliberately, and with such clarity that no one in the room dared look away. She began with the facts. The day she was pulled over, the moment she presented her military ID, the second officer, Derek Slater, dismissed it and placed her in cuffs without cause. Then she played the footage, her hidden recording, the audio clear and devastating. Gasps echoed when Slater's voice crackled through the speakers. "You people think your titles mean something out here? You should learn your place." Then came the silence, heavy, deafening. Naomi let it sit. Then she continued. She shared how her case led to over 40 new reports filed against Slater in just 1 week. She listed the names, many anonymous for their safety, of community members who had suffered quietly for years. She didn't cry, but her voice trembled slightly as she said, "I fought overseas for this country. I never thought I'd have to fight for my dignity at home." Across the room, heads bowed. Council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. And then, as Naomi reached into her folder, she produced one final document, a formal request for an independent civilian oversight board to hold officers accountable with power to investigate, subpoena, and act. The crowd rose in applause. But one more voice was waiting, a soft voice from the back of the room. "My name is Emily Slater. I'm Officer Slater's daughter." The room went silent again. Emily walked slowly to the podium, wearing her rookie uniform, her badge barely a month old. "I joined the force to serve with honor," she said, "but I can't do that while protecting lies. I support Colonel Carter's request, and I'm ready to testify under oath." The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in release. In that moment, Naomi didn't just win the room, she changed the narrative. No longer just the victim. She was now the voice of a town waking up. The chamber had just begun to settle from the emotional storm stirred by Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter's testimony when a quiet voice interrupted from the back. "My name is Emily Slater," it said. "I'm Officer Slater's daughter." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Even Naomi turned slightly, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. Emily, in full uniform, stepped forward slowly. Young, composed, and visibly shaken, she walked the same aisle her father had likely once strutted down with pride. But she wasn't carrying his arrogance. She was carrying the weight of truth. The council chair leaned into the mic. Miss Slater, are you here to submit a statement? Emily nodded. Yes, but not the one anyone expects. You could hear a pin drop. She took her place at the podium, her voice soft but clear. I became a police officer to make a difference, to honor what I thought the badge stood for. But I can't stay silent, not anymore. She paused, steadying herself. Growing up, my father was respected. He came home with stories about catching the bad guys, about protecting our streets. I believed every word. I wanted to be just like him. She inhaled deeply. But during my training, I met someone who changed my perspective. Colonel Naomi Carter. She volunteered at the academy, offering leadership classes to cadets. Her words challenged me, inspired me, and made me ask questions I had avoided for too long. Emily turned toward Naomi. I didn't know at the time that she would one day be the woman my father wrongfully arrested. Gasps filled the room. I reviewed the footage, Emily continued, and I recognized something in his tone, in his face, not the officer I looked up to, but the one others feared. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a USB drive. This contains timestamps, memos, and shift logs that contradict statements my father made in previous reports. I didn't want to see it, but it's the truth. The council members exchanged stunned glances. Naomi said nothing. She simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the courage unfolding before her. Emily looked back at the crowd. This isn't about tearing someone down. It's about rebuilding something better. Accountability isn't betrayal. It's how we heal. Tears welled in more than a few eyes. Her final words echoed through the room. I still believe in the badge. I just don't believe it should be used as a shield for injustice. The crowd erupted, not in frenzy but in reverent applause. In that moment, the story transformed, not just about power and corruption, but about conscience, about choosing truth, even when it costs you something deeply personal. Naomi had lit the flame, but it was Emily who carried it forward, into places only family could reach. The hearing chamber was silent when the council reconvened the next morning. What had started as a procedural review had become a public reckoning. The testimonies of Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter and Emily Slater had shifted the tone from legal debate to moral judgment. No one, not even Officer Derek Slater himself, could deny that something irreversible had occurred. Slater sat stiffly at the defense table, no longer the self-assured figure who had once walked through the precinct with impunity. His trademark smirk was gone. The sunglasses gone. What remained was a man exposed, surrounded by paperwork, evidence, and the weight of a community that no longer feared him. The council chair cleared his throat, looking somber. After careful review of video footage, official reports, community complaints, and sworn testimony from both civilians and law enforcement personnel, including Officer Slater's own daughter, this panel has reached a decision. He paused, letting the gravity of the moment land. We hereby recommend the immediate termination of Officer Derek Slater's employment, the revocation of his state law enforcement certification, and the submission of all related evidence to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The words dropped like bricks. Slater's mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but there was nothing left to say. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. It was over. A supervising officer from Internal Affairs walked toward him. With deliberate care, he reached forward and removed Slater's badge from his uniform, then his sidearm, then his ID. Each motion felt like a chapter closing. In the front row, Naomi Carter sat still, hands folded in her lap. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply watched the wheels of justice finally turn. Behind her, the audience didn't cheer. They stood silently, reverently, witnessing history in their own small town. What once seemed impossible had happened. A protected officer had been held accountable, in full view of the public he once abused. Slater stood, escorted out of the room, no longer Officer Slater, just a man with a long list of wrongs and nowhere left to hide. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered like moths to light, but Naomi declined every microphone. She wasn't interested in interviews. Her statement had already been made, on the record, with dignity. Inside the station that once shielded him, Changes began immediately. Files previously ignored were reopened. Officers once complicit were reassigned or placed under review. A civilian review board, championed by Naomi and signed into motion that very afternoon, began taking shape. The department that had once turned its back on the people was now under their watchful eye. And though the badge was gone from Slater's chest, its meaning had finally been restored for those who wore it with honor. Accountability had come, not with a bang, but with truth. And this time, it stuck. The weeks that followed the hearing were unlike anything the town of Riverside had seen. What had once been whispered in alleys and avoided in church pews was now discussed openly, in barbershops, classrooms, council meetings, and living rooms. The fall of Officer Derek Slater hadn't just made headlines, it had shattered an illusion. For years, the people believed the system wouldn't change. Now they had proof that it could. The Riverside Police Department, once cloaked in unearned authority and silence, began a slow but visible transformation. Under pressure from public outcry and in response to the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee, the department implemented sweeping reforms. Every officer was now required to undergo bias training, de-escalation workshops, and a full review of prior complaints. For the first time, body cameras were worn consistently, and footage was regularly reviewed by a panel that included citizens from the very neighborhoods most impacted. At the heart of these changes was Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter. Though not a member of the department, she was invited to help redesign its field training curriculum. She accepted, not for prestige, but to ensure that future officers would understand the weight of the badge before ever pinning it on. Naomi led weekly seminars titled Service Before Authority, drawing from her 20 years of military experience and the very encounter that sparked the reform. New recruits sat in quiet awe, many hearing firsthand what courage without anger sounded like. Her message was simple: power without humility is a weapon, not a tool. But she wasn't alone. Among her first group of trainees was Officer Emily Slater. Despite the shadow of her father's legacy, Emily stood tall, respected not for her name, but for her integrity. She became a liaison between the community and the department, visiting schools and community centers to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. The results were felt almost immediately. In just 6 months, civilian complaints dropped by 58%. Community members began attending town halls not to shout, but to participate. Former critics of law enforcement now sat across from officers in conversation, not confrontation. Patrol routes were adjusted based on neighborhood feedback. Officers started knowing residents by name, not just by profile. Riverside didn't become perfect. It didn't erase the past, but it became better. And more importantly, it became honest. 1 year after her arrest, Naomi stood quietly in the back of the same council chamber where it had all unfolded. This time, there were no cameras, just a small ceremony welcoming a new class of cadets. She watched as they took their oath, not with bravado, but with understanding. The shift had come, not because of outrage alone, but because someone dared to stay calm when she had every right to be furious. Because she chose to lead, not retaliate. Riverside had been broken, but through courage, truth, and unity, it had begun to heal. A soft wind rustled the autumn leaves outside the Riverside Public Service Academy, where a new generation of cadets gathered in the training hall, polished boots, crisp uniforms, eyes wide with both nervousness and ambition. At the back of the room, standing by herself, was Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter, arms crossed gently, a small smile playing on her lips. No one clapped when she entered. She hadn't asked for a spotlight, and yet everyone knew who she was. The woman whose silence had dismantled arrogance. The woman who never raised her voice, but raised a city's conscience. She didn't bring protest signs. She didn't tweet into the void. She carried a pocket-sized camera, a worn ID, and a relentless sense of right and wrong. Now, a year after her unlawful arrest, Naomi stood before cadets not to tell them what to think, but to show them how to see. "How many of you believe courage is loud?" she asked softly. Several hands rose. She nodded. "Sometimes it is, but other times courage is quiet. It waits, it watches, and when the moment comes, it refuses to move." She paused. "That's what I did. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't run. I stood still, and I watched the system around me reveal itself. A silence swept through the room, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Courage, she continued, isn't always a heroic leap. Sometimes it's a deep breath when you want to yell. It's recording when you know no one will believe you. It's walking back into the station the next day when you'd rather walk away forever. In the front row, Officer Emily Slater sat listening, eyes locked on the woman who'd helped her redefine her oath. Emily had become a trusted face in the department and an example of change from within. Their stories had begun on opposite sides of a badge, but ended side by side in rebuilding a broken culture. Naomi closed her talk with the words that had become her legacy. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to kneel. As the cadets stood to applaud, she quietly stepped away from the podium. Her job wasn't to bask in the light. It was to make sure it stayed on, so the next person caught in the shadows wouldn't have to stand alone. Outside, the sun was rising, faint but steady. So was Riverside. And Naomi Carter? She didn't lead a revolution with fire. She led it with stillness, grace, and unshakable courage, not to be remembered as a victim, but as the force that reminded an entire town that even in silence, courage can speak volumes. In a world that often moves too fast and forgets too easily, the story of Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter offers something rare and powerful. A reminder that some of life's greatest acts of courage don't come with shouting or spectacle. They come in silence, in dignity, in knowing who you are and standing your ground even when the world tries to move you. For many in our older generation, we've seen it all. We've marched, we've protested, we've written letters and voted in elections that shaped the country we live in today. We've also seen how systems, even when dressed in authority, can falter. We've watched the badge become both a symbol of honor and, too often, a shield for injustice. But Naomi's story doesn't just call out wrongdoing. It reminds us that real change happens when people act with integrity, not rage, with poise, not panic. Naomi didn't fight back with fists. She fought with facts. She didn't scream for attention. She used calm, calculated action to hold a corrupt officer and the system that protected him accountable. And she did it not to become famous, but because she believed in something deeper, the quiet strength of doing what's right, even when it costs you something. That's a lesson many of us know too well. We've raised children and grandchildren with those same values. We've lived through seasons of injustice where standing still was the most powerful thing we could do. We've learned that being loud isn't always being strong, and that character is revealed not in the spotlight, but in the dark, when no one else is watching. Naomi's courage also teaches us that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration. She didn't destroy a man for the sake of revenge. Instead, her calm exposure of the truth forced a system to reflect on itself, to break from old patterns, and to build something better. She didn't just change the rules. She changed hearts, especially when Emily Slater, the daughter of the very officer who wronged her, chose to stand beside her rather than behind the lies. That moment was more than dramatic. It was deeply human. It reminded us that people can choose what's right, even when it's painful. Even when it means stepping away from their own family's shadow. For those of us in our golden years, we often ask, what legacy are we leaving behind? Naomi's story answers that beautifully. A legacy doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be true. It's about leaving behind a trail of dignity so others can walk a little taller. It's about helping younger generations understand that respect isn't given by uniforms or titles. It's earned through humility, service, and truth. It's about raising voices not just in protest, but in purpose. And perhaps most importantly, this story tells us that it's never too late to hold systems accountable, to teach, to lead, and to inspire. Naomi didn't seek justice in her youth. She did it with the wisdom of experience. She knew her rights. She knew her value. And when the time came, she used her stillness like a sword. Let's also remember the ripple effect. Because of Naomi, over 40 other victims found their voices. Because of Naomi, an entire town changed how it policed its people. Because of Naomi, new recruits were trained differently, not just in tactics, but in truth. And because of Naomi, a once divided community learned that the badge can represent more than just authority. It can symbolize accountability, empathy, and renewal. For anyone watching this who has ever felt overlooked, unheard, or too old to make a difference, this story is your reminder that you still matter. Your wisdom matters, your presence matters, and your voice, no matter how softly it speaks, can change the world when spoken with purpose. So what do we take from Naomi Carter's journey? We learn that silence doesn't mean weakness, that patience is power, that real reform begins not with noise, but with knowledge, and that the greatest revolutions sometimes begin not with fire, but with one person saying, "I won't be moved." If this story moved you, press 7 in the comments to show your support not just for Naomi, but for every person who ever stood for truth with quiet courage. Share this video with your family, your friends, or someone who needs hope right now, because these are the stories that remind us what we're capable of. And don't forget to follow our channel, where we continue to bring you powerful stories that inspire, uplift, and prove that even the calmest voices can change everything. Because when courage stands still, the world can't help but listen.